Good evening. Tony Blair was carried into Downing Street today on a political landslide and on a wave of Labour jubilation. He'd have a majority in the Commons of 179, Labour's best result ever. For the Conservatives, it was a nightmare. Their first election defeat since 1974 and their worst since 1832.
Tony Blair was swept to power in 1997 with an historic landslide. He would go on to win 3 elections and would go down in history as the second longest serving Prime Minister in modern times. He became leader in 1994 following the death of John Smith and would immediately set about reshaping and rebranding the Labour Party in his image, embracing a third way ideology that accepted much of what Thatcherism had transformed about Britain, but attempted to find a middle way between this change and the social democracy that had preceded it. In constitutional matters, his government was radical and reforming, and his government introduced landmark legislation to promote equality for LGBT plus people, including equalising the age of consent, scrapping Section 28, ending the ban on gay people serving in the military, and introducing civil partnerships for same-sex couples. His government also had considerable domestic achievements, including the dramatic reduction in NHS waiting lists and reductions in both child and pensioner poverty. In foreign affairs, his government was also responsible for the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. But it is in this arena that he has faced the fiercest criticism, with many arguing that the Iraq War, which was launched based on a false pretext, sullies his legacy. Many would also criticise his government for not going far enough with the power given to his government by 2 landslide election victories and 3 terms in office. What we can certainly say is that Blair doesn't rank with the truly transformative Prime Ministers, Attlee and Thatcher, both of whom forged a considerable consensus that lasted decades. But nor should his impact be understated.
It shall be a government rooted in strong values, the values of justice and progress and community, the values that have guided me all my political life, but a government ready with the courage to embrace the new ideas necessary to make those values live again for today's world. A government of practical measures in pursuit of noble causes.
Throughout the election campaign, Blair had sought to reassure voters that a new Labour government would not mean a return to tax and spend, and this reassurance continued as New Labour took office, with Gordon Brown announcing that he would make the Bank of England independent within days of the election taking place.
This is the time to take tough decisions, the tough decisions we need for the long-term interests and prosperity of the country. I have therefore decided to give the Bank of England operational responsibility for setting interest rates, with immediate effect.
A revolution from Gordon Brown on his first full working day in office.
He said it was the most radical reform in the bank's 300-year history.
During Blair's first term, his commitment to not increase the basic or higher rate of income tax and his commitment to stick to Conservative spending plans constrained his government, and Gordon Brown, his Chancellor, became notorious for using so-called stealth taxes to find money to fund needed investment. This fiscal restraint meant that Blair needed to look elsewhere for bold change, and so Blair's first term is synonymous with major constitutional change, including devolution of power for Scotland and Wales, the abolition of most of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords, and the introduction of the Human Rights Act and the Freedom of Information Act. Looking back at the legacy of his government, these changes were to remain one of his most significant legacies.
We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident and that her partner, Dodi Fayed, has also been killed. They were apparently being pursued by paparazzi on 2 motorcycles.
Prime Minister, can we please have your reaction to the news?
I feel like everyone else in this country today. People everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain.
The death of Princess Diana on 31st of August 1997 was a moment where Blair rose to the moment, finding the right words to express how many people in the country felt. This was something Blair excelled at, particularly in those early years when his popularity was at its height. Perhaps Blair's greatest gift was his oratory, and he liked nothing more than to make an argument to a hostile crowd. It's what allowed him to succeed as a politician over rivals like Gordon Brown, and it's what would sustain him in office, even as his government was to confront crisis and controversy.
Good afternoon from Chequers, the Prime Minister's country home. I'll be talking to Tony Blair in his first interview since the storm broke over tobacco advertising and Formula One. How will he deal with suspicions that have been aroused in this, the first real political crisis to hit his government? That's after the news, read by Maurice.
The first crisis to hit Blair's government was a serious one. It arose after Blair's government made the decision to exempt Formula One from a ban they were introducing on tobacco advertising in sport. The owner of Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone, had made a £1 million donation to the Labour Party earlier that year, and he was in talks with the party over future funding. We now know that Blair personally intervened to exempt Formula One from the legislation just hours after meeting with Mr Ecclestone, but at the time, Blair survived the crisis, highlighting the extent to which the image of Blair as Teflon Tony was an accurate reflection of how many people felt about him at the time.
A historic agreement for peace in Northern Ireland has been reached within the past few minutes. We can see pictures now from Stormont.
This agreement is good for the people of Ireland, North and South. It was made possible by the leadership, the commitment, the personal negotiating skill of Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern.
I want to say this to the politicians and to the people of Northern Ireland, with all the force that I can muster. Even now, this will not work unless in your will and in your mind you make it work.
Perhaps the biggest achievement of Blair's first term, and indeed his premiership, was the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. The agreement meant that Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK, with powers being exercised in Stormont under a power-sharing agreement. The fact that Northern Ireland was assured a future as part of the United Kingdom gave assurance to the Unionist community about their future, but the agreement also held out hope to the Republican community by also promising a referendum on a united Ireland whenever there was a settled will for this to happen. This skillful compromise brought lasting peace and an end to the Troubles, an astonishing diplomatic achievement for which Blair is rightly praised.
And once Big Ben strikes 10 and the last vote is cast, we'll have our exit poll predicting the result. The famous exit poll, the last poll of the election, sometimes right, sometimes not quite so right. NOP this time have asked 18,000 voters in constituencies across the country to fill in a simulated ballot paper outside the polling station just after they've voted. And fingers crossed, if they've been filled in truthfully, we won't have egg on our faces when the real results start coming through in 3/4 of an hour. And our exit poll says another Labour landslide. Tony Blair has won that second full term for Labour that was always his ambition. We are saying a Labour majority of around 160. It could be a bit either side of that. It could even be above the 179 that they
Given the scale of the Conservative Party's defeat in 1997 and the good economic conditions that Blair's government was to enjoy all the way through his time as Prime Minister, the result of the 2001 election was never really in doubt, as Blair came to power for a second term with another historic landslide, delivering a majority of 167 seats in the House of Commons. Following this victory, Blair's government would finally be bold enough to increase national insurance by 1% to invest in the National Health Service, which was to help bring down waiting lists and increase health outcomes. Some of the fiscal timidity that characterised the first term was gone, but this timidity, allied to their third-way belief in partnerships between the public and private sectors, had led them to make what many regard as one of their biggest mistakes: the signing of expensive private finance initiatives contracts to build schools and hospitals in a way that wouldn't require an upfront cost, but which would place a burden on the British state for a long period into the future. However, it was events overseas that would have the most influence on the rest of Blair's time in office, most notably the terrorist attacks against the United States on September the 11th, 2001.
As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
The September the 11th attacks killed 2,977 people, making them the deadliest terrorist attack in history. The US President George W. Bush was to respond by launching a war on terror that would lead Britain and America to go to war first against the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001, and then against the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 2003. Looking back with hindsight, both of these wars look like foreign policy misadventures, but it was the Iraq War that would eventually sink Blair's popularity. In the run-up to the conflict, around 1 million people marched through the streets of London, but in Parliament Blair made an impassioned speech and won a vote that was never really in doubt, as he had the support of then Leader of the Opposition Ian Duncan Smith. Here is an excerpt from that speech.
To retreat now, I believe, would put at hazard all that we hold dearest. Turn the United Nations back into a talking shop, stifle the first steps of progress in the Middle East, leave the Iraqi people to the mercy of events on which we would have relinquished all power to influence for the better. Tell our allies that at the very moment of action, at the very moment when they need our determination, that Britain faltered. I will not be party to such a course. This is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing. I beg to move the motion.
In the end, Britain joined the United States in the Iraq War, the legacy of which for Blair himself is almost wholly negative, fatally damaging the trust of the British people and alienating some of Labour's core support. The consequences for Afghanistan, Iraq and the wider region are also largely negative, with both conflicts resulting in significant loss of life and with both countries descending into civil war, leading to instability in the wider region, strengthening forces that the war on terror was supposed to contain, and destabilising the wider Middle East.
The voting's almost done. The excitement of election night is about to begin. Big Ben strikes 10, the polling stations will close. It will be too late to vote, and I can give you the result of our exit poll, which is this election has been won by Labour, but with a majority down from 160 to 66. The Conservatives are on 209, that's a gain of around 44 seats.
Blair went into the 2005 election promising to stand down midway through the Parliament and managed to secure an historic third term. But this was largely a fluke of the first-past-the-post electoral system, which gave Labour a majority of 66 seats in the House of Commons with just 35.2% of the vote. Blair's decision to stand down after 2 years of the new Parliament ended up being a political masterstroke, as it enabled him to set a timetable for his own departure, and it meant that he went out on a high to a rousing standing ovation in the House of Commons. Gordon Brown would take over in 2007 and would then have to deal with the financial crisis and its fallout, which damaged Labour's economic credibility and led to defeat in 2010, leaving the party with just 29% of the vote. In assessing Blair's legacy, the Iraq War looms large, but there were considerable domestic achievements, introducing the minimum wage, huge strides on gay rights, massive constitutional change, and big improvements in public services from when Labour took office, with more teachers, nurses and doctors, producing smaller class sizes and shorter waiting lists. Child poverty and pensioner poverty were also reduced, and inequality fell due to policies such as tax credits introduced by Gordon Brown as Chancellor. The critique of Blair's time in office is not that he didn't do anything, but that he didn't do enough, and that what he did do was too easy to reverse. A truly transformative Prime Minister doesn't just have an impact for the years they're in office, they cast a long shadow for decades afterwards. Thatcher and Attlee managed this, but Blair didn't, which means that he must rank below them if we're assessing his legacy overall. I hope you enjoyed this video, which is part of a series of videos on British Prime Ministers. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and maybe check out some of the other videos. For now, goodbye and best wishes.